Maria Bennett stood at Gate 47 in the Denver spaceport with her boarding pass in hand and her heart full of excitement because she was finally going home after 6 months on a distant planet called Kepler 442b, where she had made the most important discovery of her career as a xenobiologist. She had found living organisms that could communicate with each other through complex chemical signals, and the scientific community was calling it the breakthrough of the century. Her ticket was for first class on the orbital station Perseus, and she had earned every credit of it through years of hard work and dedication to her field. The gate area was crowded with travelers from all over Earth, and the colonies and the massive windows showed the landing pads where sleek spacecraft were being prepared for departure. Maria felt proud wearing her expedition jacket with the Earth Science Council patch on the shoulder, and she carried a small case containing samples and data that would change humanity's understanding of alien life forever. Karen Walsh sat behind the gate counter looking at her screen with a bored expression on her face because she had been working at this spaceport for 3 years, and every day felt the same to her. She processed tickets and dealt with passengers and went home to her small apartment, where she spent her evenings watching old Earth shows and complaining to her cat about her life. When Maria approached the counter with a bright smile and handed over her ticket, Karen looked up and her eyes narrowed immediately. She saw a young black woman in her 30s with natural hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing casual but professional clothing, and something inside Karen twisted with resentment. Karen had grown up in a small town where everyone looked like her and thought like her, and even though humanity had spread across the stars and made contact with alien species, Karen still carried the same prejudices her parents had taught her. She took the ticket from Maria's hand and scanned it with her reader, and the screen showed that everything was legitimate and paid in full. But Karen didn't care about what the screen said. Maria noticed the change in Karen's expression, but she had seen that look before in her life, and she tried to ignore it because she just wanted to get on her flight and present her findings at the conference. The spaceport was busy with announcements echoing through the terminals and families saying goodbye, and pilots walking past in their crisp uniforms. Karen stared at the ticket for a long moment, and then she looked at Maria with cold eyes and said that there was a problem with the ticket. Maria felt her stomach drop because she had checked everything 3 times before leaving her hotel, and she knew the ticket was valid. She asked what kind of problem, and Karen said that the ticket appeared to be fraudulent. Maria's voice remained calm, but her hands started to shake a little because she couldn't believe this was happening, and she explained that she had purchased the ticket directly from the official booking system, and she had her confirmation codes and her identification, and everything was in order. Karen picked up the ticket and held it in both hands and looked Maria directly in the eyes and said that people like her didn't belong in first class, and then she tore the ticket in half. The sound of the paper ripping seemed louder than all the noise in the terminal, and Maria stood there in shock, watching the pieces of her ticket flutter down to the counter. She felt heat rising in her face and her chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe because this was 2247, and humanity had traveled to other star systems and made peace with alien civilizations, but here she was, being judged by the color of her skin. Other passengers nearby had stopped to watch, and some of them looked uncomfortable, while others pulled out their personal devices to record what was happening. Karen called out for security in a loud voice and said there was a situation at the gate. Maria tried to speak, but her voice came out smaller than she wanted, and she said that this wasn't right, and that she had done nothing wrong. Karen ignored her and waved her hand dismissively and told her to step away from the counter. 2 security drones floated over from their stations near the wall, and their red optical sensors focused on Maria, and she felt like a criminal, even though she had dedicated her life to expanding human knowledge. The crowd around the gate was growing larger, and Maria could hear whispers and see people pointing, and she wanted to disappear, but she also knew she had to stand her ground. She had faced dangerous wildlife on alien planets and survived equipment failures in hostile environments and negotiated with creatures that didn't even breathe oxygen, but this moment in a spaceport on her home planet felt like one of the hardest challenges of her life. Karen smiled behind her counter because she felt powerful in that moment, and she didn't care about the rules or the consequences because in her mind she was right, and this woman didn't deserve to be in first class. The security drones hovered closer to Maria, and their mechanical voices asked her to please step back from the counter. Maria looked around at all the faces watching her, and she saw some people shaking their heads in disgust while others looked away because they didn't want to get involved. She thought about her parents who had fought through the early days of space colonization when discrimination was even worse, and how disappointed they would be to know that things hadn't changed as much as everyone claimed. She thought about the alien fungal network she had discovered and how those organisms worked together in perfect harmony without judging each other based on appearance, and she wondered why humans who claimed to be so advanced couldn't do the same thing. The terminal announcements continued in the background, calling out gate numbers and departure times in the normal business of the spaceport went on around this terrible moment that was unfolding at Gate 47, and Maria stood there holding the torn pieces of her ticket in her trembling hands while Karen Walsh sat smugly behind her, counter-believing she had won. Marcus Webb had been sitting in the waiting area near Gate 47, drinking a cup of terrible coffee and reading news feeds on his tablet when he heard the commotion at the counter. He was a freight hauler who had spent the last 20 years moving cargo between Earth and the outer colonies, and he had seen enough injustice in his travels to recognize it when it was happening right in front of him. He was a big man with dark skin and gray hair at his temples and hands that were scarred from years of loading containers and fixing broken equipment in zero gravity. Marcus had been born in Chicago back when the city was still recovering from the climate wars, and he had worked his way up from nothing to owning his own small transport ship. He stood up from his seat and walked toward the gate counter because something about the scene didn't sit right with him, and when he got closer he recognized the woman who was holding torn pieces of paper in her shaking hands. Marcus had seen Maria Bennett's face on the news feeds 3 weeks ago when she had made first contact with intelligent alien life, and the whole solar system had been talking about her discovery. He remembered watching the interview where she had explained how the fungal network on Kepler 442b could solve complex problems together and how this might help humanity understand collective intelligence better. Now here she was being treated like a common criminal by some gate agent who clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Marcus pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, and his voice came out loud and clear when he said that everyone needed to hold on just a minute. Karen Walsh looked up at him with irritation in her eyes and told him that this didn't concern him, and he needed to step back. Marcus planted his feet and crossed his arms and said that it concerned him just fine because he knew Maria Bennett, and he knew she was a respected scientist who had just made history. Karen felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but she wasn't about to back down in front of all these people, and she told Marcus that the woman's ticket was fraudulent and security was handling it. Marcus looked at Maria and saw the humiliation and anger in her face, and he felt his own anger rising, because this was exactly the kind of thing that made him ashamed of his own species sometimes. He said that he had seen Dr. Bennett on the news and there was no way her ticket was fake, and Karen needed to explain what was really going on here. Other passengers were recording everything now, and some of them were posting it to social media feeds in real time, and within minutes the incident was being shared across the solar system. A young woman in a pilot's uniform stepped forward from the crowd and introduced herself as Lisa Chung, and said she had flown Dr. Bennett on 2 previous occasions, and her tickets had always been legitimate. Lisa was in her late 20s, and she had worked hard to become a commercial pilot, and she believed in standing up for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. She showed her pilot credentials to the security drones and explained that she was witnessing what appeared to be discrimination based on race, and she wanted it documented in the official record. Karen's face was getting red now, and she could feel control of the situation slipping away from her, and she snapped that all of these people needed to mind their own business or she would have security remove them too. More passengers were joining the crowd now, and some of them were speaking up and saying that they had been watching the whole thing, and the gate agent had torn up a valid ticket for no reason. An elderly man with a cane said he had lived through the unification wars and he thought humanity had moved past this kind of hatred. A teenage girl with purple hair said she was recording everything and sending it to her mother, who worked for the Interstellar News Network. Maria felt tears building up behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall because she didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She looked at Marcus and Lisa and all the other people who were standing up for her, and she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and sadness because she was grateful for their support but sad that she needed it in the first place. The security drones were hovering uncertainly now because their programming told them to follow the gate agent's commands, but their Sensors were detecting that a large number of passengers were disputing the agent's authority. One of the drones sent an alert to the main security office, and within seconds the incident was flagged as a potential public relations crisis. Karen was starting to panic now because she realized that this wasn't going the way she had expected, and all these people with their cameras and their loud voices were making her feel attacked. Marcus stepped closer to the counter, and his voice was calm but firm when he said that Karen needed to call her supervisor right now, because this situation was completely unacceptable. Lisa agreed and added that as a licensed pilot, she was required to report any incidents of discrimination she witnessed, and she was definitely going to file a formal complaint. Other passengers were shouting questions at Karen, asking why she had torn up the ticket and what gave her the right to treat someone that way. Karen felt trapped behind her counter with all these angry faces staring at her, and she wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't think of any explanation that would make sense because the truth was that she had acted on pure prejudice, and there was no policy or procedure that justified what she had done. She tried to say that she was just doing her job, but her voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to her own ears. The crowd continued to grow, and people from other gates were walking over to see what all the commotion was about, and the terminal was filling with voices and tension. Maria finally spoke up, and her voice was stronger now, and she said that all she wanted was to get on her flight so she could present her research at the conference, and she didn't understand why that was so difficult. She held up her identification card and her conference credentials and the confirmation codes for her ticket, and she asked Karen to explain exactly what was fraudulent about any of it. Karen couldn't answer because there was no answer, and she just stared at her computer screen, wishing she could disappear. The security drones received another alert, and this time it was marked urgent, and it came from someone with high-level authority. Codes, and Karen felt her heart sink because she knew that meant someone important was coming, and she was about to face consequences she hadn't anticipated. When she had torn up that ticket 5 minutes ago, Daniel Foster had been in his office on the upper level of the spaceport reviewing compliance reports when the alert came through on his tablet, and he immediately pulled up the security feed from Gate 47. He was the Federal Aviation Authority's Regional Director for Interstellar Operations, and he took his job very seriously because he believed that space travel should be safe and fair for everyone. Daniel was 45 years old with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned him respect throughout the industry. He had worked his way up from being a safety inspector to his current position, and he had seen a lot of problems in his career, but watching the security feed from Gate 47 made his blood boil in a way that few things did. He saw a gate agent tearing up a passenger's ticket and calling security on a woman who was clearly not causing any disturbance, and he knew exactly what was happening because he had dealt with similar incidents before. Daniel stood up from his desk and grabbed his uniform jacket because he wanted everyone to know exactly who he was when he arrived at that gate. His assistant, Nina Rodriguez, looked up from her desk in the outer office and asked if everything was okay. Daniel told her to pull up the file on gate agent Karen Walsh immediately, and Nina's fingers flew across her keyboard, and within seconds she had the information on her screen. She told Daniel that Karen Walsh had 3 prior complaints in her personnel file for discriminatory behavior toward passengers. Daniel stopped in his tracks and asked why someone with 3 complaints was still working at the spaceport. Nina explained that the previous supervisor had downgraded all the complaints to verbal warnings, and that supervisor had retired last month. Daniel felt anger mixing with determination, because this was exactly the kind of systemic problem he had been trying to root out since taking this position. He told Nina to come with him and bring her tablet with all of Karen Walsh's records, and they left the office and headed toward the escalators that would take them down to the main terminal level. As they walked, Daniel was already planning what he was going to do, because this wasn't just about one bad gate agent, but about sending a message that discrimination would not be tolerated in his spaceport. They rode the escalator down, and Daniel could see the crowd gathered at Gate 47 from the upper level, and he could tell the situation was tense. Other passengers were stopping to watch, and security personnel were starting to converge on the area, and Daniel knew he needed to get there quickly before things escalated further. He walked fast through the terminal with Nina keeping pace beside him, and people moved out of their way when they saw his uniform and the serious expression on his face. When they reached Gate 47, the crowd had grown to about 50 people, and everyone was talking at once, and the security drones were hovering nervously, and Karen Walsh looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Daniel pushed through the crowd, and his voice cut through all the noise when he said everyone needed to step back and give him room. The crowd went quiet immediately because people recognized authority when they saw it, and Daniel had the kind of presence that commanded respect. The security drone scanned his identification codes and immediately backed away because his authority level overrode any commands they had received from the gate agent. Daniel walked up to the counter and looked at Karen Walsh with cold eyes and told her to step away from her terminal right now. Karen felt like she might throw up because she knew she was in serious trouble, and she tried to explain that she was just doing her job. Daniel held up his hand to stop her and said that he had been watching the security feed, and he knew exactly what she had been doing. He turned to look at Maria Bennett, and his expression softened when he saw the torn ticket pieces in her hands and the mixture of anger and humiliation on her face. He introduced himself as Daniel Foster, the regional director for the FAA, and he told Maria that he was deeply sorry for what had happened to her. Maria nodded but didn't trust herself to speak yet, because she was still trying to process everything that had happened in the last 10 minutes. Daniel turned back to Karen and asked her to explain why she had torn up a passenger's valid ticket. Karen stammered something about the ticket looking suspicious, and Daniel pulled up his tablet and showed her the screen where Maria's ticket was clearly marked as legitimate and verified through the central booking system. Daniel read the details out loud so everyone could hear that the ticket was purchased at 8:47 that morning and paid in full and issued to Dr. Maria Bennett, who was a distinguished xenobiologist and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Scientific Achievement. The crowd murmured, and several people said they knew it all along, and Karen felt everyone's eyes on her like physical pressure. Daniel asked Karen what policy or procedure had authorized her to tear up this ticket, and Karen couldn't answer because there wasn't one. Marcus Webb spoke up from the crowd and said that he had witnessed the whole thing, and the gate agent had said that people like Dr. Bennett didn't belong in first class before she tore up the ticket. Several other passengers confirmed this, and Lisa Chang said she had recorded the audio on her personal device. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, because this was even worse than he had thought, and there was no way to interpret those words as anything other than racial discrimination. He told Karen that her employment with the Denver spaceport was terminated effective immediately, and she would be escorted to Human Resources for processing. Karen's face went white and she started to protest, saying that he couldn't do this and she had rights. Daniel said that Dr. Bennett had rights too, and Karen had violated every one of them. He told Nina to escort Karen Walsh to HR immediately, and to ensure that her security clearance was revoked and her access to all systems was terminated. He also said that Karen would be referred to the FAA's Office of Civil Rights for formal investigation, and depending on their findings, criminal charges might follow. Nina nodded and gestured for 2 human security officers who had just arrived to help escort Karen away from the gate. Karen tried to argue, but the security officers took her arms gently but firmly and led her away through the crowd, and people watched her go with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity. Daniel watched until Karen was out of sight, and then he turned his full attention to Maria and asked if she was all right. Maria took a deep breath and said she just wanted to get to her flight and present her research. Daniel nodded and said he was going to make sure that happened, and he was also going to make sure this never happened to anyone else. He started typing on his tablet and told Maria that he was personally upgrading her ticket to the executive suite, which included a private cabin with full research capabilities. He was also flagging her profile as a VIP traveler, which would prevent any future incidents. Maria felt tears finally escape from her eyes, but these were different tears, and she thanked him quietly. The crowd around them started to applaud, and Marcus Webb clapped Maria on the shoulder and said that justice had been served, and Lisa Chang smiled and gave her a thumbs up. Nina Rodriguez returned to Gate 47 after escorting Karen Walsh to the Human Resources office, and she was carrying a new ticket that she had printed in the Executive Services office. She handed it to Maria with an apologetic smile and told her that her boarding time was in 30 minutes and asked if she would like to wait in the executive lounge. Maria looked at the pristine new ticket with its gold, embossed logo, and she felt a strange mixture of emotions because part of her was grateful for the upgrade, but another part of her was angry that she had needed to go through such a humiliating experience to receive basic respect. She thanked Nina and said she would appreciate using the lounge, and Nina told her to follow, and she would show her the way. Daniel told Maria that he would personally ensure her flight departed on time, and that the captain would be informed of the situation so that the crew could provide her with anything she needed during the journey. Marcus Webb stepped forward and shook Maria's hand and told her that she was an inspiration, and that what she had discovered on Kepler 442b was going to change everything for humanity. Maria smiled and thanked him for standing up for her when he didn't have to, and Marcus said that it was what decent people did and humanity needed to stick together, especially when they were spreading out across the stars. Lisa Chang came over and gave Maria her contact information and said that if she ever needed a pilot for any future expeditions, she would be honored to fly for her. Other passengers from the crowd also approached to offer their support, and several people apologized for not speaking up sooner, and Maria told them that she understood because standing up to injustice was hard and she appreciated everyone who had eventually found their voice. The crowd began to disperse as people returned to their own gates and flights, but the energy in the terminal had changed because everyone who had witnessed the incident knew they had seen something important. Daniel watched Nina lead Maria toward the executive lounge, and then he turned to address the remaining passengers and airport staff who were still gathered around Gate 47. He told them that what had happened here was unacceptable, and it violated every principle that the FAA stood for, and he wanted everyone to know that there would be serious consequences for anyone who engaged in discriminatory behavior. He said that the spaceport was conducting a full investigation into its hiring and training practices, and that he expected every employee to treat every passenger with dignity and respect regardless of their race or background. Several staff members nodded seriously, and a few looked nervous because they were wondering if their own behavior would come under scrutiny. Daniel told the security drones to file a complete incident report, including all video and audio recordings, and to flag this case as high priority for the Civil Rights Office. He then walked over to the gate counter where Karen Walsh had been sitting, and he looked at the computer terminal and pulled up the activity logs. Nina had rejoined him, and she looked over his shoulder and pointed out several entries that showed Karen had processed tickets normally for other passengers but had flagged Maria's ticket as suspicious despite the system showing it was valid. Daniel shook his head and said this was clear evidence of intentional discrimination, and it would make the civil rights case very easy to prove. He asked Nina to pull the personnel files for everyone who worked at this gate over the past 6 months because he wanted to see if there was a pattern of complaints. Nina said she would have the report ready by end of business, and Daniel thanked her and told her she was doing excellent work. The executive lounge was on the upper level of the terminal, and it had comfortable chairs and real plants and windows that looked out over the landing pads where spacecraft were being serviced. Maria sat down in a soft chair and accepted a cup of real coffee from the lounge attendant, and she finally allowed herself to relax a little. Her hands were still shaking slightly, and she could feel the adrenaline starting to wear off and being replaced by exhaustion. She pulled out her tablet and checked her messages and saw that she had dozens of notifications from colleagues and friends who had already seen videos of the incident spreading across social media. Her mentor, Dr. Stephen Park, had sent her a concerned message asking if she was okay and telling her that he was proud of how she had handled herself. Maria sent him a quick reply saying she was fine and would see him at the conference in 2 days. She opened her research files and tried to focus on her presentation, but her mind kept replaying the moment when Karen had torn her ticket and the look of contempt in the woman's eyes. Maria had experienced racism before in her life, but it never got easier, and every incident left her feeling tired and frustrated. She thought about how far humanity had come in the past 2 centuries with faster-than-light travel and colonies on distant worlds and contact with alien species, but somehow they still couldn't figure out how to treat each other with basic human decency. She wondered what the Myconian collective would think about human behavior if they knew about incidents like this, because the fungal network she had discovered on Kepler 442b worked together in perfect harmony without any concept of discrimination or hatred. The organisms shared resources and information freely and made decisions collectively, and they had built a thriving ecosystem that had lasted for thousands of years. Maria sipped her coffee and looked out at the spacecraft on the landing pads, and she thought about all the humans working on those ships and traveling to distant stars, and she hoped that maybe someday they would learn to be better. The lounge attendant came over and asked if she needed anything else, and Maria shook her head and thanked her. The attendant hesitated and then said that she had seen what happened at the gate, and she wanted Maria to know that not everyone felt the way that gate agent did. Maria smiled and said she knew that because she had seen how many people had stood up for her, and the attendant nodded and said she hoped Maria had a good flight. After the attendant left, Maria opened her tablet again and started making notes for her presentation, because work had always been her refuge when things got difficult. Down in the terminal, Daniel was meeting with the spaceport director Gregory Stone in his office, and Gregory looked worried because he knew this incident was going to generate a lot of negative publicity. Daniel told him that the publicity was deserved because the spaceport had allowed a toxic culture to develop among some of its employees, and it was time to clean house. Gregory argued that most of their employees were good people, and Daniel agreed but said that good people needed to work in systems that supported them, and right now the system had failed. He told Gregory that he wanted a complete review of all hiring practices and training programs, and he wanted diversity consultants brought in to work with the staff. Gregory said that would be expensive, and Daniel replied that discrimination lawsuits were also expensive, and preventing problems was always cheaper than fixing them after the fact. Gregory sighed and said he would authorize the review, and Daniel said he would be monitoring the progress personally. The boarding call for the orbital station Perseus came through the lounge speakers, and Maria Bennett gathered her belongings and made her way to the private boarding entrance that was reserved for executive suite passengers. The attendant who escorted her was professional and kind, and she made sure Maria was comfortable as they walked through the quiet corridors away from the main terminal. Maria appreciated not having to face another crowd because she felt emotionally drained from everything that had happened. The private boarding tube connected directly to the executive section of the spacecraft, and when Maria entered her cabin, she was impressed by how spacious and well-equipped it was. There was a comfortable bed and a work desk with multiple screens and a small bathroom with a real shower, which was a luxury on most spacecraft. She stored her luggage and sat down at the desk and pulled up her research files again, because focusing on her work helped her feel more in control. The spacecraft began its departure sequence, and Maria felt the familiar vibration through the hull as the engines powered up. She had made this journey between Earth and the orbital stations dozens of times, but it never stopped being amazing to watch the planet fall away beneath her. The cabin had a large window, and she looked out as Denver Spaceport grew smaller, and the Rocky Mountains stretched out like wrinkles in the Earth's surface. Within minutes, they had broken through the atmosphere, and the sky turned from blue to black, and the stars appeared in their full glory without any interference from air or light pollution. Maria thought about how humans had always looked up at those stars with wonder, and now they traveled between them as easily as people once traveled between cities. She wondered if the early space pioneers had imagined that their descendants would still be struggling with the same prejudices that had plagued humanity for centuries. Her communicator chimed, and she saw it was a call from Stephen Park, who was already on the Perseus waiting for her arrival. She accepted the call, and his friendly face appeared on her screen. Stephen was in his 50s with gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes, and he had been Maria's mentor since she was a graduate student. He asked if she was okay, and Maria said she was fine now, but it had been a rough morning. Stephen told her that everyone at the conference had seen the videos, and they were all talking about what had happened, and many people were outraged. Maria sighed and said she didn't want to be famous for being discriminated against, but Stephen said that sometimes important things came from terrible experiences. He told her that the scientific community was rallying around her, and several prominent researchers had already issued statements condemning the spaceport's behavior and calling for stronger protections for travelers. Maria appreciated the support, but she also felt uncomfortable with all the attention, because she wanted people to focus on her scientific work rather than what had happened to her. She told Stephen that she was worried her presentation would be overshadowed by the incident, and people would see her as a victim rather than a scientist. Stephen said he understood her concern, but he believed people were capable of seeing her as both someone who had experienced injustice and someone who had made an incredible discovery. He reminded her that the fungal network on Kepler 442b was the most significant finding in xenobiology in decades, and nothing could diminish that achievement. Maria smiled and thanked him for always knowing what to say, and Stephen told her to get some rest during the flight, and they would talk more when she arrived on the Perseus. Back on Earth, Daniel Foster was sitting in a conference room with his legal team, and they were reviewing the evidence against Karen Walsh and discussing the broader investigation into spaceport practices. The lawyer, Patricia Hill, told Daniel that they had a very strong case for termination and potential criminal charges because the video evidence was clear and there were multiple witnesses who had given statements. She said that Karen's previous complaints created a pattern of behavior that would be difficult for any defense attorney to explain away. Daniel asked about the previous supervisor who had downgraded those complaints, and Patricia said they were referring his case to the Department of Justice for investigation because deliberately hiding discrimination complaints was itself a violation of federal law. Daniel nodded and said he wanted everything done by the book because this case was going to receive a lot of public attention, and they needed to set a clear example. Nina Rodriguez entered the conference room with a tablet full of data, and she told Daniel that she had completed the initial review of personnel files, and the findings were troubling. She had identified 17 other complaints against various spaceport employees over the past year that had been downgraded or dismissed without proper investigation. The complaints involved everything from verbal harassment to denying services, and in every case the complainant had been a person of color or someone from a minority group. Daniel felt sick to his stomach because this indicated a systemic problem that went far beyond one bad gate agent. He asked Nina to contact every single person who had filed a complaint and offer them the opportunity to have their cases reopened and properly investigated. Patricia warned that reopening old cases would be time-consuming and expensive, but Daniel said it was the right thing to do, and that was what mattered. The news coverage of the incident had spread across Earth and the colonies, and it was now the top story on most major networks. The Interstellar News Network had interviewed several passengers who had been at Gate 47, and they all told the same story about Karen Walsh tearing up Maria's ticket and making racist comments. Marcus Webb had given a particularly powerful interview, where he talked about serving in the colonial defense forces and fighting to protect humanity's interests and how disappointing it was to see humans treating each other so poorly. Lisa Chang had also spoken to reporters, and she said that as a pilot, she had seen discrimination in many forms throughout her career, and it was time for the industry to take these issues seriously. The network had also obtained statements from several of Maria's colleagues who praised her scientific work and expressed outrage at how she had been treated. Public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of Maria and critical of the spaceport, and within hours there were calls for congressional hearings and new legislation to strengthen anti-discrimination enforcement in the space travel industry. Senator Patricia Williams announced that she would be introducing a bill to mandate annual anti-discrimination training for all spaceport employees and to create harsher penalties for violations. She said that the Bennett incident was a wake-up call for everyone who believed that humanity had moved past racism and prejudice. Some commentators pointed out that this was not an isolated incident, and that people of color had been reporting discrimination in space travel for years, but their complaints had often been ignored or minimized. Others argued that the swift response by Daniel Foster showed that the system could work when people in positions of authority took these issues seriously and were willing to act decisively. Maria watched some of the news coverage on her cabin screen during the flight, and she had mixed feelings about everything. On one hand, she was glad that people were talking about discrimination and maybe something good would come from her terrible experience. On the other hand, she felt exposed and vulnerable because millions of people had now seen her at one of her worst moments. She thought about all the other people who had experienced similar incidents, but didn't have crowds of supporters or powerful officials to intervene on their behalf. She wondered how many people had just accepted mistreatment because they didn't think anyone would believe them or help them. These thoughts made her determined to do more than just give her scientific presentation at the conference because she now had a platform, and she intended to use it to speak out about discrimination in the scientific community and the space travel industry. The orbital station Perseus was one of humanity's largest space stations, and it orbited Earth at a distance that made the planet look like a beautiful blue marble against the darkness of space. The station served as a hub for scientific conferences and research collaboration, and it housed laboratories and living quarters for thousands of scientists and support staff. When Maria's spacecraft docked with the station, she felt a sense of relief because this was a place where people usually judged her by her work rather than her appearance. She gathered her belongings and made her way through the docking tube into the station's main arrival area, where Stephen Park was waiting for her with a warm smile. He gave her a hug and asked how her flight had been, and Maria said it had been peaceful and she had managed to get some rest. Stephen told her that her cabin was ready and they had reserved one of the best conference rooms for her presentation. As they walked through the station's corridors, Maria noticed that people were looking at her, and some were whispering to each other. She realized that everyone here had probably seen the videos from the spaceport, and she felt self-conscious. Stephen seemed to sense her discomfort, and he started talking about the conference schedule and the other presentations that would be happening. He told her that 3 Nobel Prize winners were presenting their latest research, and there was a lot of excitement about new discoveries from the outer colonies. Maria appreciated him trying to distract her, and she started to relax as they discussed science. They reached her cabin, which was a modest but comfortable room with a bed and a desk and a small window that looked out at Earth. Stephen told her to settle in and meet him for dinner in 2 hours, and then they would go over her presentation together. After Stephen left, Maria unpacked her things and took a shower and changed into fresh clothes. She sat down at her desk and opened her research files and started reviewing her presentation for what felt like the 100th time. The discovery of the Myconian collective on Kepler 442b had been the result of 6 months of careful observation and study. The fungal network covered nearly 40 square kilometers of the planet's surface, and individual organisms were connected through an underground system of thread-like structures called FAA. These connections allowed the organisms to share nutrients and information across vast distances, and Maria had discovered that they could solve complex problems by working together as a collective intelligence. When she had introduced a maze experiment into their environment, the fungal network had found the most efficient path through it within days even, though no individual organism had the capacity to understand the entire maze. The implications of this discovery were enormous for humanity's understanding of intelligence and consciousness. Traditional human thinking had always focused on individual minds, but the Myconian collective showed that intelligence could emerge from connections between simple organisms. Maria believed this could help humans design better computer networks and even improve how human societies work together. She had spent weeks writing her presentation to make these ideas clear and accessible to both specialists and general audiences. Now she was worried that people would be so focused on what had happened at the spaceport that they wouldn't pay attention to the science. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was a professional, and she would deliver her presentation with confidence regardless of the circumstances. Dinner with Stephen was in one of the station's dining areas that had windows overlooking Earth, and the food was surprisingly good for space station fare. Stephen asked Maria how she was really doing, and she admitted that she felt overwhelmed by all the attention and uncertain about how to handle it. Stephen told her that he had been contacted by the Interstellar Civil Rights Coalition, and they wanted to know if she would be willing to work with them on developing better training programs for spaceport employees. Maria was surprised and asked why they had contacted her, and Stephen said it was because she had experienced discrimination firsthand, and because she was respected in the scientific community, and people would listen to her. Maria said she would think about it, but right now she wanted to focus on her presentation and her research. Stephen understood and changed the subject to lighter topics, and they spent the rest of dinner talking about mutual friends and sharing stories from their recent travels. After dinner, they went to the conference room where Maria would be presenting, and they set up the equipment and ran through a practice version of her talk. Stephen offered suggestions on pacing and emphasis, and Maria made notes about areas she wanted to strengthen. By the time they finished, it was late and Maria was exhausted, so she thanked Stephen and headed back to her cabin. She lay in bed looking out at Earth through her window and thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about Karen Walsh and wondered what had made her so full of hatred, and she thought about Daniel Foster and Marcus Webb and Lisa Chang and all the people who had stood up for what was right. The next morning, Maria woke up early and spent time meditating and doing breathing exercises to calm her nerves before the big presentation. She put on her best professional outfit and reviewed her notes one more time, and then she made her way to the main conference hall. The hall was enormous with seating for over 1,000 people, and when Maria arrived, she saw that it was already filling up. Stephen met her backstage and told her that they had received requests from thousands more people who wanted to attend virtually, and the organizers had set up a live stream. Maria felt butterflies in her stomach, but she also felt excited because this was her chance to share her discovery with the world. The conference moderator, Dr. Helen Price, came backstage and introduced herself and told Maria that she was looking forward to the presentation. When it was time, Helen walked out on stage and introduced Maria to the audience, and Maria took a deep breath and walked out into the bright lights. The audience applauded, and she stood at the podium and looked out at all the faces, and she felt a surge of confidence. She began her presentation by showing images of Kepler 442b and describing the environment where she had made her discovery. She explained how the fungal network operated and showed data from her experiments and discussed the implications for understanding collective intelligence. As she spoke, she could see people leaning forward in their seats and taking notes and nodding with interest. She forgot about the incident at the spaceport and lost herself in the joy of sharing knowledge. When she reached the conclusion of her presentation, she showed a final image of the Myconian collective glowing with bioluminescence under the alien sun, and she said that this discovery reminded her that intelligence and cooperation could take many forms. She said that humanity had much to learn from organisms that work together without ego or prejudice, and that maybe the path forward for human civilization was to embrace that kind of collective thinking. The audience burst into applause, and many people stood up, and Maria felt tears in her eyes, because this was why she had become a scientist. After the applause died down, Helen opened the floor for questions, and dozens of hands shot up. And for the next hour, Maria answered questions about her methodology and findings and future research plans. After the presentation ended, people crowded around Maria, wanting to talk with her and exchange contact information, and several research institutions expressed interest in funding follow-up expeditions to Kepler 442b. Maria felt overwhelmed but also energized by all the enthusiasm and support. Stephen eventually rescued her and took her to a smaller room where she could decompress and have some lunch. He told her that her presentation had been brilliant and that people were already calling it one of the most important talks in the conference's history. Maria smiled and said she was just glad people had focused on the science rather than the drama from the spaceport. Stephen said that the science was so compelling that it had overshadowed everything else, and that was exactly how it should be. 3 days after her presentation, Maria received a message from the Interstellar Civil Rights Coalition, asking if she would be willing to meet with them, and she decided it was time to seriously consider their proposal. The coalition was a group of activists and lawyers and educators who worked to fight discrimination throughout human space, and they had a good reputation for getting results. Maria agreed to a video call and found herself talking with their director, Dr. Raymond Cole, who was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had spent his career fighting for equal rights. Raymond told Maria that they had been working on developing training programs for space industry employees, but they needed someone with credibility and experience to help make the programs effective. He said that Maria's story had resonated with millions of people, and her voice could make a real difference. Maria asked what exactly they wanted from her, and Raymond explained that they were creating a comprehensive training curriculum that would cover implicit bias and cultural competency and practical scenarios that employees might encounter. He said they wanted Maria to help develop the scenarios based on her own experiences and to participate in some of the training sessions as a speaker. He emphasized that they understood she had her own career and research to focus on, and they would work around her schedule. Maria thought about it and realized that if she didn't get involved, then nothing would change and other people would continue to experience what she had experienced. She told Raymond that she was willing to help, but she had some conditions, including that the training needed to include input from other people who had experienced discrimination and that there needed to be real consequences for employees who failed the training. Raymond agreed to her conditions and said they were already planning to include diverse voices in the development process. He mentioned that Daniel Foster from the FAA had also expressed interest in being involved because he wanted to improve enforcement mechanisms and create standardized protocols for handling discrimination complaints. Maria was pleased to hear that Daniel wanted to continue working on this issue because she had been impressed by how decisively he had acted at the spaceport. Raymond also told her that Marcus Webb and Lisa Chang had contacted the coalition and offered to help in whatever way they could. Maria felt a surge of hope because maybe this coalition of people who cared about justice could actually make a difference. They scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next week, and Raymond sent her some preliminary materials to review. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Daniel Foster was dealing with the fallout from his investigation into the Denver spaceport, and the findings were even worse than he had initially thought. His team had discovered that the discrimination problems went back years and involved multiple employees and supervisors. The culture of the spaceport had become toxic, with certain employees feeling emboldened to mistreat passengers because they knew their supervisors would protect them. Daniel had fired 6 more employees and formally reprimanded a dozen others, and he had brought in new management to oversee a complete restructuring of the spaceport's operations. The legal department was preparing cases against several former employees, including Karen Walsh, who was facing criminal charges for violating civil rights laws. Daniel knew this process would take months or even years to fully resolve, but he was committed to seeing it through. He received an invitation to participate in the training program development with the Interstellar Civil Rights Coalition, and he accepted immediately because he saw it as an opportunity to prevent future incidents rather than just responding to them after they happened. He had a video call with Raymond Cole and Maria Bennett, and they discussed what effective training should look like. Daniel emphasized that training needed to be mandatory and ongoing, rather than just a one-time thing, and that there needed to be clear metrics for measuring whether the training was actually changing behavior. Maria agreed and added that the training needed to include real stories from people who had experienced discrimination, so that employees could understand the human impact of their actions. Raymond took notes and said he would incorporate all of these suggestions into the curriculum design. Daniel also mentioned that he had been contacted by several other spaceport directors who wanted to implement similar reforms at their facilities before they had their own incidents. He said this showed that people in the industry were paying attention and were willing to make changes if they had the right tools and support. Maria asked if he thought the changes would last, or if people would lose interest once the news coverage died down. Daniel said that was a legitimate concern, but he believed that if they built strong systems and created accountability, then the changes would stick. He pointed out that the new legislation being proposed by Senator Patricia Williams would mandate these reforms by law, which would provide additional enforcement power. Maria said she hoped he was right because she didn't want to have gone through that experience for nothing. The 3 of them talked for over an hour, and by the end of the call they had outlined a basic structure for the training program. It would include modules on recognizing implicit bias and understanding different cultural perspectives, and practicing appropriate responses to various scenarios. There would also be a component about the legal and professional consequences of discrimination, and a section on how to report incidents and support people who experienced mistreatment. Raymond said his team would start developing the detailed curriculum, and they would reconvene in 2 weeks to review the first draft. Daniel and Maria both agreed, and they ended the call feeling like they were part of something meaningful. Maria spent the next few days attending other conference presentations and networking with colleagues, and gradually she started to feel like herself again. The incident at the spaceport was still in her mind, but it didn't dominate her thoughts the way it had immediately afterward. She had several productive conversations with other researchers about potential collaborations to study the Iconian Collective further, and she was excited about the possibility of returning to Kepler 442b for additional fieldwork. Stephen Park told her that several universities were competing to offer her faculty positions and research funding, and she would need to make some decisions about her future soon. Maria said she would think about it, but right now she was content to finish out the conference and then take some time to rest and process everything that had happened. On her last night on the Perseus, there was a social event where conference attendees gathered to celebrate the end of a successful week of scientific presentations. Maria attended and found herself surrounded by colleagues who wanted to congratulate her on her presentation and express their support for her after what had happened at the spaceport. Several senior scientists told her stories about their own experiences with discrimination and how they had overcome them, and she realized that she was not alone in her struggles. A young graduate student approached her nervously and thanked her for speaking out because she said it gave her courage to report discrimination she had experienced at her own university. Maria felt her eyes getting wet as she hugged the young woman and told her that things would get better if people kept speaking up and supporting each other. Marcus Webb sent Maria a message saying that he had watched her presentation recording, and he was impressed by how brilliant she was and how well she had handled everything. He said that humanity was lucky to have scientists like her who were not only smart, but also brave enough to stand up for what was right. Lisa Chang also sent a message saying that she had signed up to be part of the training program development because she wanted to help make the space industry better for everyone. Maria replied to both of them, thanking them for their support and telling them how much it had meant to her when they had stood up for her at Gate 47. She realized that the incident had connected her with people she might never have met otherwise, and that maybe there were silver linings even in terrible experiences. 6 months later, Maria Bennett stood in a conference room at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. alongside Daniel Foster and Raymond Cole and Marcus Webb and Lisa Chang as they presented the completed training program to a room full of space industry executives and government officials. The program had taken months to develop, and it incorporated input from dozens of people who had experienced discrimination, as well as experts in psychology and education and law enforcement. The curriculum included video scenarios and interactive exercises and assessment tools, and it was designed to be adaptable for different types of organizations. Maria felt nervous as she prepared to speak, but she also felt proud because this was something tangible that had come from her painful experience at the Denver spaceport. She began by telling her story not in graphic detail, but in enough depth that people understood what it felt like to be discriminated against when you were just trying to do your job. She talked about the humiliation and the anger and the fear, and then she talked about the people who had stood up for her and how important that had been. She said that everyone in the room had the power to either perpetuate discrimination or stop it, and the choice was theirs to make. Marcus spoke next, and he talked about his years in the space industry and the discrimination he had witnessed, and how it hurt not just the victims but also the companies and organizations because it drove away talented people and created toxic work environments. Lisa talked about being a young female pilot and dealing with people who assumed she wasn't capable, and how important it was to have training that addressed all forms of bias. Daniel presented the enforcement mechanisms that would accompany the training, including standardized reporting procedures and mandatory investigations and clear consequences for violations. He emphasized that training alone wasn't enough, and there needed to be accountability at every level of an organization. He showed data from the Denver spaceport where they had implemented these reforms and demonstrated that complaint rates had actually gone up initially because people felt safer reporting incidents, and then had started to decline as the culture improved. He said this was exactly the pattern they wanted to see, because it meant the system was working. Raymond concluded the presentation by discussing the legal framework and how the new legislation from Congress would mandate this training for all space industry employees and create federal oversight to ensure compliance. The response from the audience was mostly positive, with several executives saying they wanted to implement the program at their facilities immediately. A few people raised concerns about costs and logistics, but Daniel pointed out that the costs of discrimination lawsuits and damaged reputations were much higher than the cost of prevention. Senator Patricia Williams attended the presentation, and she stood up to announce that her legislation had enough votes to pass and would be signed into law within weeks. She thanked everyone involved in developing the training program and said that the Bennett incident had been a catalyst for long overdue changes in how the space industry operated. The room applauded, and Maria felt tears in her eyes because this was real progress, and it had happened because people had refused to stay silent. After the presentation ended, there was a reception where people could ask questions and discuss implementation details, and Maria found herself talking with dozens of industry leaders who wanted to hear more about her experience and her recommendations. Some of them apologized for their own organization's failures to address discrimination and promised to do better going forward. Maria appreciated the apologies, but she told them that what mattered most was action, not words. She said they needed to create systems where people felt safe reporting problems and where those reports were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Several people thanked her for her courage in speaking out, and she told them that she hadn't felt courageous at the time, but she had decided that if she had to go through something terrible, then she was going to make sure something good came from it. Daniel approached her during the reception and told her that he had some news about Karen Walsh. The criminal trial had concluded, and Karen had been found guilty of violating civil rights laws and sentenced to community service and mandatory bias training and probation. She had also been permanently banned from working in the space industry. Daniel said that several other former employees from the Denver spaceport had also faced consequences, and the message was clear that discrimination would not be tolerated. Maria nodded and said she didn't take pleasure in anyone's punishment, but she hoped the consequences would make other people think twice before acting on their prejudices. Daniel agreed and said that accountability was essential for creating real change. Marcus and Lisa joined them, and the four of them talked about their plans going forward. Marcus said he was starting a mentorship program for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to work in the space industry because he believed in creating opportunities for the next generation. Lisa said she was working with her pilots' union to strengthen their anti-discrimination policies and create support networks for members who experienced harassment. Maria told them about her plans to return to Kepler 442b for additional research, and she said she was also joining the faculty at the University of Chicago, where she would teach xenobiology and continue advocating for diversity in science. Daniel said he was staying at the FAA and focusing on enforcement, and he was also planning to write a book about building inclusive organizations because he wanted to share what he had learned with a wider audience. They all agreed to stay in touch and continue collaborating on civil rights issues because the work was far from finished. Raymond Cole joined their conversation and told them that the Interstellar Civil Rights Coalition was already receiving requests from organizations in the outer colonies who wanted to implement the training program, and he was working on adapting it for different cultural contexts. He said that what they had started was spreading across human space, and that gave him hope for the future. Maria smiled and said that maybe humanity was finally learning to live up to its ideals. Marcus laughed and said that humans were always works in progress, but at least they were making progress. As the reception wound down, Maria stepped outside onto a balcony that overlooked the city, and she thought about everything that had happened since that terrible morning at Gate 47. She had experienced one of the worst moments of her life, but it had also connected her with amazing people and led to changes that would help countless others. She thought about the Myconian collective on Kepler 442b and how those simple organisms had figured out how to work together for the common good, and she hoped that humanity would eventually do the same. She pulled out her tablet and looked at the latest data from the monitoring station she had left on the planet, and she saw that the fungal network was thriving and growing, and she felt a sense of peace knowing that somewhere out among the stars there was at least one place where cooperation and harmony prevailed. Stephen Park had sent her a message earlier in the day, congratulating her on the successful presentation and telling her how proud he was of everything she had accomplished. He said that she had become not just an outstanding scientist, but also an important voice for justice, and he knew she would continue to do great things. Maria replied, thanking him for his support and mentorship over the years, and telling him that she couldn't have done any of this without people like him who believed in her. She looked up at the sky even though it was daytime and she couldn't see the stars, and she thought about all the places humanity had yet to explore and all the discoveries that were still waiting to be made. She thought about the children who would grow up in a world where the training program she had helped create was standard and where discrimination was taken seriously and punished appropriately. She hoped those children would have easier lives than she had, but she also knew that progress was never permanent and every generation had to fight for justice in its own way. Daniel Foster came out onto the balcony and stood beside her, and they looked out at the city together without speaking for a moment. Finally, he said that he wanted to thank her for being willing to turn her pain into something constructive, because not everyone would have had that strength. Maria said she didn't feel particularly strong, but she felt responsible because she had a platform and resources that many people didn't have. She said that for every person like her who experienced discrimination and was able to fight back, there were thousands who suffered in silence because they didn't have support or didn't think anyone would believe them. Daniel nodded and said that was exactly why systemic changes were so important, because they protected everyone, not just the people who were able to advocate for themselves. They stood there for a while longer, watching the sun set over the city and thinking about the work that still needed to be done and feeling grateful that they had found each other and formed a coalition of people who cared about making the world better. The future was uncertain, but they knew they would face it together, and they would keep fighting for a humanity that truly lived up to its highest ideals as it spread across the stars.